All right. So I'm recording. So if your camera's on, be mindful of that. Oh, all right. Okay. So we're going to start out with, there are 5 different sections that we're going to look at today. And I'm sorry if this sounds a little bit like a lot of information, but there's a lot of information that our churches and other, that our churches haven't really given us access to. For example, I think a lot of churches have not really been able to take the history of the Bible seriously with their members of the church, just because, folks really like things to kind of stay the same way and kind of want a message that is not going to be as challenging. But the very creation of the text itself is very challenging if you look at the history behind all of this. So as some of you have seen, maybe the last video that I posted on Facebook about this study, we're going to look at different, I've kind of formatted it in this way of communication, because the biblical text is all about communication and miscommunication and misinterpretation and different translations. All this kind of stuff, thousands of years of all this kind of stuff is lumped into this this study. I'm just kidding, not everything. I know it's so exciting. Big attempt. All right. So the framework of communication that folks mostly know is that there's a sender, right? That there is a message, and then that there's a receiver, right? So basically, when we're talking about the sender, we're talking about the writers of the Bible and what influenced them to write the text that they wrote. I know that there are a lot of people out there who might believe that the text comes straight from God and that there is no there's no room for interpretation or translation or any of that. But you'll see along the way that there are different things that influence the message of the Bible and how we receive the message of the Bible. So we have to remember that the senders have their own context in which they are living, even the language that they're using, the examples that they're using, imagery that they're using, all of that stuff is not simply straight from God, but it comes from somewhere. It has to come from their surroundings. It has to come from the language that they grew up with, right? It's not just from nowhere. Then you have the message itself, which is, in this context, is the Bible. And the Bible itself has a bunch of different things going on with it, like people throughout history have interpreted it and also put it together in a different way. Also want to note that there are different versions of the Bible. There are different books and canons. So when I say canons of the Bible, that's like the canonical Bible that some of us know. There are different types in different regions. Like the Catholic Bible has different books than like the Ethiopian Bible, which has different books from the Protestant Bible, which has different books from the Greek, which has different books from the Hebrew Bible. I'm basically saying there's a bunch of different Bibles. Okay, so there's not just even just one, right? And then the final thing is the receiver, that is the reader. Like, how do you, like, what is it about you that influences how you read the Bible? Like, if I am somebody who is a conservative, straight, white man from, from Orange, that's going to be very different than an interpretation of my actual self, which is a queer, trans, Filipino, who's living in the Bay Area, you know? So all of these things are influenced by different things. So if you ever run into people who are like, yeah, come through to our church or come through to our community because everything is just straight from the Bible, understand that what does that even mean? What does that even mean? All right. So that's just a brief overview. Any questions so far or comments? Okay. All right, we good? Good? Okay. You tell me if this is too much. I don't want to be like that meme where the guy has the writing and he's like, and then because conspiracy theories looking meme. Okay, anyway. So, let's start with the context of the writers. Hold up. First of all, get a little closer to y'all. The context here's the list of books. I know you can't really see it clear, but you can see that the different Bibles have different books, and so they're different lengths too, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, people aren't even in agreement as far as like what writings are necessarily most necessary for the Christian faith. Yes. Okay. All right. So the context of the writers. First of all, I tried to find what is it? I tried to find okay. So hold on. I got this. Okay. One of the things that we want to be sure of when we're thinking about the writers is not to stereotype people in the Bible. I feel like there's a tendency for us to think that people in the Bible were very backwards in their thinking and stuff like that. We assume that they're not as reflective as they actually were and as we are these days. I think part of that is colonialism, where we are going to undermine the knowledge, the science even, that people were learning and passing down from cultures, ancient cultures, you know. Like farmers know a lot of things. They have a lot of knowledge, they have a lot of wisdom, and there's a specific science that comes with farming. Same thing with fishermen. Same thing with, you know, other folks who took up jobs that were connected to the earth, connected to the land and creation. And so I think that sometimes our Western view of looking at people in the Bible is that we assume that they're just inherently like cavemen, like thinking, and very primitive in their thinking. Yeah, so that's one thing that we have to think about when we're thinking about the context of the writers. Another thing, though, that we don't want to do is that we don't want to say we were exactly like us either. We don't want to assume that somebody who was living in slavery times, that we know exactly what that experience is like, given that we're in a different context now and in these days, all right? So that's just a couple of things that we should think about when we think about the context of the writers. All right. Okay. Any questions or thoughts so far? All right. I hope this isn't too academic sounding. I really don't like sounding like that. But there's a thing called, I have to say this because we're talking theology, Sitz im Leben, which means kind of your place in life, your social location. Some activists might know this as social investigation, like what your background is and all that kind of stuff. We have to remember that the writers had their own Sitz im Leben, Germans and academic stuff, you know. Yeah. So you remember that they grew up in a context. Their faith was formed in a context. All right. So another thing we have to remember about the people who are sending the message, who are writing the Bible, is that there were cultures mixing at the time. If we want to talk about something like a pure Christianity, that would be difficult to pinpoint. We forget sometimes that there were already religions and beliefs at the time and in the area of the Near East, where Christianity and Judeo-Christianity was being formed. Linnea, you're so loud. Okay, so Hinduism was around from the 6th century BCE, or before the Common Era. Hinduism, right? That's how old Hinduism is. And if you want to look at it in the context of like history around Palestine, the 6th century was like, when was that? It was like the Neolithic stage in history. That's how old Hinduism is.
Wow.
That's like amazing, right? That's a really old religion. Okay. And then Buddhism came around in the 5th century before the common BCE, before the Common Era. And that is also in like the Neolithic area, time in Neolithic era. Those are really old religions. To say that those two religions, very strong religions, had no influence in Asia, continental Asia at the time, now we know as continental Asia, is kind of like, what is a pure Christianity then if people have been practicing this religion for thousands and thousands of years before Jesus even came? Yes. And then Islam came in 600 CE, 600 Common Era. So there are thousands of years, centuries and centuries that this Bible encompasses. It's not just something that someone wrote and then put together. It's like thousands of years of tradition, of generations handing this down. And also, first of all, handing it down, because we're talking about the Neolithic the Neolithic era, folks were handing this down orally or through imagery, right? Through writing. So in the Bible, if you run into texts that sound like they're repeating the same story over and over again, or they're, repeating the same word over and over again, it's because it's from an oral tradition. And so it was the best way for people to remember stories being passed on. And so then after that, it's like thousands of years, hundreds of years, until these stories, these very stories that were passed down through oral tradition, were then written into text. That's a lot. I know. Okay. So we didn't even get into the history of the writers very much, other than that we have people who were writing and telling story, or who were telling stories during the Neolithic era. We have people who are telling stories throughout the Copper and Bronze Age. We have people telling stories into the Iron Age, and then you have the Empire Age, so like Neo-Babylonian, Persian Empire, Greek Empire, Roman Empire. Like, that's how much this Bible encompasses. That's how much of human history this Bible is attempting to encompass. That blows my mind. Right?
Mine too.
Yeah, right? Okay. Any questions right now about what I've said so far? I also want to throw in something else that's probably going to make everything way more complicated. The fact that language changes over time. Slang changes in English language. Slang changes like year to year. Imagine how much language changes over hundreds of years. 10 years. We have people who speak English and English is their only language and they can't understand Shakespeare. Like, imagine stories being in ancient Hebrew, and then a modern person who can speak like Hebrew trying to interpret it, they wouldn't be on the same page. All right. So
I kind of, Janelle, this is Margaret. I do have a question.
Yeah.
And, you might not be able to answer this, but I'm just thinking back I'm thinking of my family, my conservative evangelical family, who will, take the Bible verbatim because they it's the divine word of God, that kind of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But these are people, I'm thinking of my nieces and nephews who have been to Christian colleges, and surely their theology studies covered the same thing. No, that there's all these different Bible, because they have to know that there's more than one Bible. They even know, they'll even say, well, I like the King James version versus the New English, Common English, whatever. Of course, the message is totally fiction in their opinion. So I'm just wondering, how does that, how can you come to that conclusion if you understand that there are all these different Bibles written? And and that it's already known that there were books taken out and put in, by the Catholic Church, by the, Judaism right there, So, like I said, maybe you can't answer that. I mean, I'm not asking you as a person who has that interpretation of the holy word, right?
Yeah. I used to have that interpretation.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, you can answer that for me then.
Well, first of all, I didn't have access to history.
Okay.
I didn't even know like that you could put history alongside the text, right? I never thought about that. I just took it as a historical document in itself. And I also felt for myself, I figured that it was God's will, that it was that the interpretations that happened, the translations that happened, that we receive the text the way that it is, because it's God's will that we receive it the way that it ended up the way that it is.
Yeah. I mean, that's how they explained it to me, how they take it,
Yeah. One person, I told one person that one time, and then she said, well, why don't we just write our own Bible then? Like, why is that outside of God's will? Like, if we just made our own version. Anyway.
Well, but in some ways we do. I mean.
Yes, that's true.
I mean, every time you're reading, everybody who reads it, I'm sure, thinks differently than, other people. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I will take that. Thank you.
Okay. Not every seminary handles not every seminary has the same curriculum in terms of like how they look at biblical history and things like that. Yeah. That's what I've heard from people in other seminaries.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because there are conservative seminaries and there are progressive seminaries. Yeah, because of what they focus on, and also what they're preparing their pastors and scholars to.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wondered how they make that distinction.
Yeah.
About which Bible, is valid, I guess.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep. Okay. Thanks for that question. All right. So we're going to move on from the sender part of the biblical message. Any other thoughts that folks have? All right. If not, then I will move into the message part of the Bible. Okay. So we have the biblical canon, right? So the Bible as we know it, and most of us in the U.S. who've grown up in, I grew up with the Protestant Bible, but in study, I've used the Catholic Bible, which wasn't really called the Catholic Bible, it's just called the Bible with the Apocrypha. Anyway, that's a lot of scholar blah, blah, blah. But, so the canon, the way that the canon came together was also in itself a very hands-on human journey, right? I'm not saying that God cannot influence these things. I think God can do a lot of good and just things. However, we also have to realize that there is historical, like I said, historical context, and that people influence things a lot too. So, okay, so I have mentioned that Islam came about around 600 Common Era. The Council of Nicaea happened in 325 Common Era. Why do I keep saying area? Common Era. So the Council of Nicaea was when Constantine, who was emperor in what we now know as Turkey, Constantinople. Yeah, that's why it's called. He decided that, hey, I would like for us to unify the church. There's this group of Christians and they're like a marginal group right now and stuff like that. But you know what? I'm going to make their religion the national religion if they find a way to kind of unify it, because we can't have people over here talking about God and Jesus this and that way, and then people over here talking about God and Jesus and Moses this and that way. We need to unify. We need to be unified on our stories, be united in what we're practicing, be united in how we view Jesus, you know? So Constantine, emperor, gathered a bunch of men, all right? Hundreds of men came through, and they met together and decided on, well, they did a bunch of different drafts. Like, people submitted different drafts of, these books should be in the Bible. Someone came up, no, these books should be in the Bible. No, these books should be in the Bible. All right. So,
did that go on?
huh? I don't, well, not that, they had a council, so it had to finish. Yeah, but not like hundreds of years, but like, yeah, a while. So imagine there's a bunch of like different pamphlets flying around of what Christianity is, right? And then you get a bunch of men together who are selected by the emperor to come up with like, these are the pamphlets that every Christian can look at. These are the pamphlets that is going to lead our faith, all right? So that's what happened. Council of Nicaea kind of unified everything. It also unified some doctrines that some Christians still believe in and some Christians think define Christianity, like the doctrine of the Trinity, you know, the Father or Creator, Son, and Holy Ghost. Like, those are arguments that these men like argued about, had back and forth about, and then they decided, okay, I guess there is a Trinity. And then I know, it's funny, right? And then what else? Oh, I believe that Jesus is fully human. And then someone like, I believe that Jesus is fully divine. I believe that Jesus is human and divine. And then they battle it out. They talk and talk and talk. And then, you know, actually people like killed each other over these conversations and over these meetings, right? And then finally people are like, okay, yeah, I believe that Jesus is both human and divine and begotten by a virgin. So, like, you can use text to argue that, and you can use text to not argue that, but at the time, they didn't have a solid Bible to even back up their arguments. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it just makes me feel like I don't want to believe in anything, you know?
I know. I'm trying to do this to, like, you know, pull out Jenga blocks from anybody. But I just think that it's really amazing and interesting and kind of absurd, you know, like all this human chaos coming together and then people drawing so much spirituality from it, right? So much guidance from it, because it can be used for guidance and liberation, right? Despite all of these things happening. And I think that's why there's God. That's why I believe in God, because despite all of these mistakes that humans make, we're still here. There's still good things in the world, and there's still things to believe in. I don't know. Maybe I'm just idealistic. So, the Testament, the Old Testament alone encompasses many centuries of books of the Hebrew Bible. Let me see, where is that? Okay. So this is just the Old Testament. I know you can't see this document. This is just the Old Testament, but Exodus, the book of Exodus with Moses and, you know, Exodus movement of Ja people. That was 1100 BCE is when that was written. All right. And then now we'll look at Proverbs. You know, some people like to quote Proverbs. That was the 5th or 6th century BCE, meaning the Old Testament alone has thousands of years just crammed into the book, you know? So for people to say that the Old Testament God is a more aggressive and angry God, they're making a statement over thousands of years of people's faith and of people's relationship with God. I understand why people make that statement, because Jesus is much more like appealing, with the words like love and love your enemy and who's my neighbor. But the Old Testament has tons of information in there too, and tons of stories in there, tons of spiritual development in there as well. All right. Let's see. Any thoughts or questions again so far? All right. Okay. So I know that saying all this stuff could be like, oh, well, what the heck is the point of looking at the Bible if like all these people had their hands all up in it and like, like what is the point of it if it's not really saying things of God? But the thing is that it is still saying things about God through people, If we are people who see beautiful things in other people, then God is still around. Like Linnea talking while she's eating. All right. But I think it benefits us the most to approach the Bible like we approach any other book, not necessarily to undermine the Bible, but to uncover what the people were going through and what the people were trying to figure out at the time. Because these were people that were experiencing oppression, they were being conquered, they had conquered others, they had been under slavery, and yet they still believed that God was with them, that they had a relationship with God somewhere, just like for those of you who've been in the Philippines, like there's still, even though people have nothing, they still have faith in something. Otherwise they wouldn't keep going. They wouldn't keep struggling. They wouldn't keep powering through. And to me, that's like very divine. So the Bible itself is very much like the journey of a people trying to figure out who they are in the context of God, a God that they know is good, a God that they know that is protecting them, and yet experiencing imperial wars, experiencing conquest, experiencing famine, Like, where is God in the midst of that? I also want to note in that question of where is God, back in those times, God was very much about a location or a place. It was very much a concrete thing. Like God was literally at the temple. That's why in temples of even Greco-Roman temples, you have statues that are there to signify the presence there, right? And also, like the US is like, oh, God is on our side, God bless America, and that's why we keep winning wars, right? So what if you are a people who is conquered and you're not winning wars? Where is God? Is your God weak? What happens if you're a people who is displaced? Does that mean that your God is gone? What happens to a people when their temples are torn down? Does that mean their God is gone? These are some of the questions that this community is asking when we're talking about the Old Testament journey. Like, who are they? Who are they? Does God still care about them? How can God still care about them? All right. I think that's it for the message, the Bible itself. Unless we go, that's it for the Bible itself. Okay, so we're going to move on to the receiver part of this, of the Bible. So us, looking at us, what have people done to the message after they've received it over time? I did mention that there are different translations, that there are different, okay, hold on. I did talk about a little bit the fluidity of language, right? Like how much even English has changed over the years. Let's see, what's an old word? People don't say psych anymore, or you got moted, like people don't say that anymore. The bomb. Or that's the bomb, or that's bunk, or all that in a bag of potato chips. Or word up.
Word up. Where do your mama?
Anyway, language. Thank you, Kira. Language changes a lot, even in one person's lifetime, right? So let's see the languages that are involved with the Bible. We have ancient Hebrew, and then we have Greek. Much
associated with the Bible?
Yeah, the Old Testament, much of it was written in Hebrew and in ancient Hebrew. And like I said, thousands of years of Hebrew.
Yeah.
And then Greek is the New Testament. Some parts of the New Testament are written in Greek. And then Aramaic, which is what Jesus spoke, which is a version of Hebrew, but not exactly.
I was going to ask for that.
It's a different language. Yeah. Aramaic. All right. We got 3 different languages here. Okay. Like I mentioned, language changes. And so people who speak Greek now are not necessarily going to know what ancient Greek, aren't going to be able to read Greek from back in those days. And then also we have Bibles. So Bibles take these 3 things and then, because we're in the US, then we translate it to English, right? And then English has a bunch of translations too, right? Do we know any translations out there? Margaret, you mentioned the King James Version.
NRSV.
Yeah, does the message count too?
It's
No, I'm on a Bible study.
It's a horrible translation, but yeah. The message, would you say NRSV? Like the message is trying really hard to be cool or something. Like
What's
NRSV? NRSV is the New Revised Standard Version. And then there's you don't have to know all these. And then there's the NIV, which is the New International Version. And then you have the NLT, which is the New Living Translation. There's a bunch of English. Oh, there's also a New King James Version.
Oh.
I see these on sale a lot. Boop, boop, boop. There are Bibles these translations are like readily available at most bookstores, and they're usually like a lot of them available. These ones are not as, you don't want this one. This one is not as available.
Wait, which one don't we want?
Well, all right, I'll get into that in a little bit.
Okay.
So, I want us to realize that although the text was written in these languages and then translated into English, the reason why they're different translations is because, like, each had a different. First of all, each were created in a different part of history. King James one is old, but there was also an agenda that came with why the translations, who made the translations and what they were for. I don't know the entire history of King James Version. I only have a little bit of knowledge about that. But I know that even amongst these, there's not necessarily a consensus for what to translate literally and what is taken as metaphor. Some of these translations attempted to translate literally, like word for word, right? And then some of these try to just capture the essence of the message. And some of these try to do a little bit of both. Okay. So, we all know that translating something from one language to another is very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Even just one word. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. What's a difficult word to interpret? Yeah, a bunch of Japanese words. Margaret, can you think of a hard to translate Japanese word?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Itadakimasu. What you say before you eat.
Yeah. Right. No one can really tell me what that means. Everyone has a different translation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I know in Tagalog there are several words that are difficult to translate. Like even basic ones like gigil is hard to translate to English. You know, like when a baby goes like this, that's gigil.
Yeah.
How do you say that?
Oh, that's so cute. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So things like that, right? Or when you light up when you're in love, like oh gosh, what do you call it? Kalig is a Filipino word. When you light up because you're like full of love or whatever. Like how do you can't describe that in English, really.
No.
If you know what that is, you know what that is in the language. So imagine taking these 3 languages and putting them into English, right? So there's already some influence going on there, you know, from human thought and human scholarship. And then given that we have all these different kinds, this isn't even all of them, right? We have the Good News Bible, other versions of the Bible. My brother gave me one that was in Pidgin, Hawaiian.
What?
Yeah. It's only the New Testament. But all of these, there's a reason why people write these. So I mostly know about the NRSV and the NIV. And the NRSV is the version that that we studied in seminary while I was at Pacific School of Religion. And this was made by a group of scholars. So it was a committee of scholars who could give feedback, who could hear feedback from one another and stuff like that. They released this. They got rid of like old language that they didn't feel was, they just didn't feel like it was relevant to the message of the text, right? But a lot of people, like a lot of liberal people embraced it. A lot of scholarly people embraced it. But some people who were more conservative and felt like the translation should be more literal, they didn't like that so much. So they responded by coming together to create the New International Version. So our church, Pine, has tons of these New International versions. And I don't like them because they were written in reaction to the NRSV.
Oh,
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Mm.
So the people who made this definitely had an agenda. People who made this had an agenda too, but for this one, I know that their agenda was because they thought this wasn't conservative enough.
Reactionary.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes. Oh. Whoa. Okay. Yes, Jack. Translation is a trip, and textual transmission is also hella trippy. I know. It's kind of. I know I'm giving you a lot of information, and you might not know what to do with it yet. That's kind of my style. I'm not going to tell you what to do with it. You just gotta figure out how to integrate it yourself. All right. Okay, so. And then imagine that these texts are also translated into other languages, right? Whew.
Sugar stuff.
Huh?
Oh, sorry. I was talking to my cat. She was
Oh,
bumping the phone.
let's see. Oh, yes. Okay, so we're on the receiver, right? So receivers have responded to the message by making a bunch of translations so that people can understand it, so we could spread the word of God. Another way that receivers have received the message is influenced through Western thought, right? I forgot to mention, by the time that the New Testament is around, there's already influence of Greco-Roman philosophy, Greco-Roman thought. Greco-Roman thought is very binary in its thinking, so you'll see it a lot in the writings of Paul, where he'll say, oh, this is of the body, but this is of God. This is of the flesh, and this is of God. It's very binary, whereas the ancient Hebrews didn't have such a binary way of viewing the world. The ancient Hebrews were able to tell various same story and be okay with it. They were able to tell various versions of the creation story, of Noah's Ark story, and then be like, oh, okay, we're cool that there are a bunch of different versions. But Greco-Roman thought makes it so that it was hard. They had to, Greco-Roman thought, the philosophy at the time was that if you had something that was true and long-lasting, it transcended the body. It transcended material things. So we came to a different place in terms of how we view God. It's less material and more about like belief, more about viewpoints, and things like that.
So amazing.
Yeah. It is.
It's crazy because, like, in context, like when you were encountered by
Come here.
God,
More. Say it.
oh, I was just gonna say, it's crazy because, like, in context, it's crazy because you're in context. If you're encountered by God, it's like it's a material thing, like that you feel. Like it's a time in your life where you're going through something, whether it's like internal oppression, external oppression, and God is like something that gets you through that material, like context, right? And so to make it about like just belief for the sake of belief, is kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah. And Greco-Roman philosophy is also influenced by people who could just sit around and think at Athens.
Leisure, yeah.
And be like, I'm wise, and and I know what truth is. So their class is definitely influencing how they do philosophy, or not their class, their socioeconomic situation.
Also makes people subjective.
Yeah.
Like, just believe just to believe, but like don't think for yourself.
Yeah. Thank you for that info, Nikki. Okay. Paradigms of interpreting the Bible. All right. So not only are we influenced by Western thought, and New Testament is influenced by Greco-Roman thought, but the way that Christianity as we know it right now has been passed on to us and entered into our communities is through colonialism. And so colonialism definitely influences the way we interpret scripture. You have Constantine, who used a Christian text and also the unifying of the church to support his empire. There was an agenda there. And then there's also Christianity used to support the agenda of colonialism. So there are a lot of things that we need to unpack when we talk about the Bible these days. And it's our responsibility to do so, or else we'll perpetuate the same empire values, the same colonial values and things like that if we're not careful. Any thoughts so far? I'm going to erase this. I'm recording anyway. Okay. Feel free to chat and stuff like that as well if you don't want to give input verbally. Now we're still talking about the receiver, and we're going to talk about the paradigms of interpreting the Bible. There's 3 ways that people have that people interpret the Bible. There is a traditional. I spell that. Traditional or conservative way, and there's a liberal way that people have interpreted the Bible, and then there is a liberation radical way that folks have interpreted the Bible. It's important to note how maybe you might be interpreting the Bible. Maybe you grew up with a more traditional conservative, and maybe you're still here, or maybe you grew up here and then moved here. The way that we read the text is alive because we are alive and our experiences change and shift all the time. So how we are defining these got another worksheet here. All right, I'm just gonna read this worksheet, all right, by Dr. Wen-In Nang. I know you can't see it. All right, so traditional conservative is defined as faith-oriented, quote unquote, faith-oriented. Church hierarchy interprets the scripture. They spiritualize material issues. Heavily doctrinal, so very much about rules and doctrine, relies on the New Testament, especially Paul.
Why? No, okay, sorry.
Okay. Christian perspective, biased in favor of Christian cultures. Minister as sole interpreter, gives ways to include laity after the Reformation. So the minister is definitely the one who is the main interpreter of the biblical text for the lay people. Then after the Reformation, then it was opened up to lay people, but it doesn't mean that lay people necessarily stepped away from the translation that they had learned, under the minister. And then there's a result. You know you're growing as a Christian because you have you have understanding and belief, right? Not necessarily changing your life or anything, but it's all in here, right? That's where all the growth is. And it's very much about orthodox. So these people are people who are reading the Bible, traditional conservative, view the Bible as the Word of God. It's literal, literalistic, verbal inspiration, personal inspiration. Those are the things they use the Bible for. All right, now we're going to head into the liberal ways that folks interpret the Bible. The Bible for liberal people, text-oriented versus faith-oriented. The scholars interpret the Bible. They say that they're being neutral or objective or scientific with their historical critical method, like there's no bias. Let's see what else. They search for archaeological evidence. They apply the Sitz im Leben, or the location in life, the social location. They apply it to the writers of the text, but they don't apply it to themselves. They don't see how they might be influencing how they read the text. Scholars accountable primarily to the academy, clergy are kind of like, oh my gosh, this baby's having a party over here. Okay.
Mama walked in.
And where was I? Oh yeah, okay. The clergy are kind of like the conduit to the laity and to the churches, all right? And let's see, the study is informational and supposedly neutral, focuses on the written text and scholars' findings and opinions, basically more scientific look, emphasizes the individual, so personalizes, psychologizes, and it's about intrapersonal stuff, right? And you know that you're growing as a person of faith. Oh, that's a cat. You know you're growing.
I know, she's just like all over the phone. She really likes this Bible study, I guess.
Awesome. I love cats. And the way that you know you're growing in faith is because your knowledge is increasing, because you feel like you're growing, and because you have a personal commitment to your faith development. All right. So liberal people see the Bible as the Word of God spoken by humans. All right. Relativization of the Bible. So they pair the Bible with history.
Okay.
What else? And the Bible gives symbolic truths and existential truths. All right. All right. Here's the third one. Now we're at liberation or radical. All right. So the way that you interpret the Bible through a liberation or radical lens is that it is community, life-oriented. The community interprets the text. See, you see how the scholar and the minister are gone? The community interprets the text. And they admit that there's a bias for the poor, the oppressed, and marginalized, whereas the liberal interpreters will say they're being neutral. The more liberation or radical interpreters will admit that they have a bias. They use the critical historical method, but from the perspective of poor, oppressed, marginalized folks, chooses and hears different texts, asks different questions, makes use of different methods. So they'll use social analysis, psychology, cultural things, real life on the ground things to influence, how they think about God. And they also use people's experience as a resource. So in terms of liberation and radical viewpoint of the Bible, you also are seeing that other people have sacred stories to contribute as well. It's not just in the Bible, but their experiences also say something about God. People who read the Bible through a liberation radical lens are accountable to community. Let's see. The Bible is a collective memory or a mirror for life, and they use it to comprehend their own reality. And they use it in the context of prayer, and the goal is social transformation, emphasis on the community, the collective, and instead of like in the traditional conservative, the result is that you have understanding and belief, but for the liberation radical folks, the result is action and social change. It's a material result and not just an intellectual thing. Yeah. Okay, so they see the Bible as the word of God spoken by and to the poor. They speaking in the historical context from the oppressed, and they also the Bible is also a way to bring together community. All right, so I am gonna invite you to think about how you've grown up knowing and learning the Bible, and how you would like to move into interpreting the Bible. Or if you're fine where you're at, that's cool too. Okay. So seeing the Bible in these 3 different ways, you can take one story and interpret it 3 different ways, right? So as the reader, you can take the story of the Good Samaritan and read it just 3 different ways. Does everyone know the story of the Good Samaritan?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. If you don't know it, you can get on Wikipedia and look at it. And yeah, you find or the Bible, duh. You can look at the Bible. So if you were to look for it in the Bible, it would be in Luke chapter 10, verse 29 through 37. So those of you who haven't cracked open a Bible in a while, this is a good story to look at. So the way that, for those of you who know the Good Samaritan story, how do you think that a conservative or traditional reading would look like? Anybody? Any thoughts? Anything? All right. Do you have any thoughts, Nikki? How would you read the Good Samaritan story in a traditional conservative way? Like, what would you take away from it if you were reading it? Okay, one way is that you would interpret the story of the Good Samaritan as, I should help people who are less fortunate. Right? Yeah. That's like the basic story. Mm-hmm. But if you were reading it from a liberal standpoint, how would you read it? Okay, I'll go into that point now. You would probably read it through asking, like, what's the relationship between Samaritans and the Jewish community, right? And you would say, how does this apply to my personal behavior, And maybe it applies to my personal behavior because if I see someone struggling, then I can pick them up and take them to the inn and give them money. Maybe I should be a more charitable person, right? That's what a liberal interpretation would be. Yeah. And then if you were to take that same story, the Good Samaritan story, and read it through a liberation lens, you would ask questions like, for first of all, the guy that the Samaritan helped, why did he get robbed and beaten in the first place? What were the conditions that that guy got robbed? Where was the priest walking to and the religious man walking to when they felt like they couldn't help the man who was robbed? Let's see, who was the Samaritan? You know, how were Samaritans viewed back then? Why does it matter that why does Jesus need to say that this person's a Samaritan that helped them? You know, so a liberation radical viewing or reading of the Bible asks more questions and also pushes the edge, right? Like, okay, if I was in this Good Samaritan shoes, how would I push further than charity? You know, how would I look at what the root causes are? How would I look at the socioeconomic context? You know, how would I participate in helping out people who are getting robbed on this road? So you just look at the stories differently. You know, it's not so much set in stone. This is what it is, and I'm going to take this simple message from it. If you get to struggle with the text, you get to wrestle with the text until something of meaning can come of it, you know, because this is a text that was largely written by oppressed peoples. Although it might have been put together by people in power, there are still people who were experiencing oppression that contributed to these texts and to these stories, right? Any thoughts or questions around that? Oh my gosh, even when you're eating.
I think
So I do have a question. That traditional, I'm sorry, I can't read.
Conservative.
Yeah, conservative traditional. So they're not taking into context like the road to Jericho, because wasn't that the road?
Was it the road to Jericho?
It was, or am I misinterpreting? Or
I think it was a road from between Jericho and Jerusalem, I think.
okay,
Yeah.
that from what I and this must be from the Liberation Radical Bible study. I don't know where, but I heard that was a really treacherous, dangerous road to be traveling.
Yeah.
Anyway, and so if you're from that traditional sense, you're not taking into context how dangerous that was, or the Samaritan being at odds with the person who was he, Hebrew, the guy that was jumped, the victim, right? They were at odds politically, socially.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
It doesn't.
Then I'm just wondering why I know that if I learned that from a traditional conservative,
Right.
you know, because that was Sunday school, right? You learn that. That's one of the first stories you learn in Sunday school.
Yeah. Well, you've just had really good pastors. Just kidding. Well, I think that asking the question of context, like who the characters are, is something that is missing here, right?
Yeah.
And that's something that you're bringing up. Even the
so that in that sense, the traditional conservative sense, you don't ask those questions. Like you just take the literal story that this guy was helped.
Yeah, it's kind of like being colorblind. Well, I'm sure there's a somewhat belittling way of viewing the Samaritan. Yeah, it was a treacherous road, and a lot of holy people actually walked that road. So that's also the question: why are people robbing people on that particular? And why is that the road that holy leaders and people?
Oh yeah, that's a good question, because then that means there must be holy leaders that were in possession of valuables that would be worth robbing, right? You know, I mean,
that's a good liberation radical way of looking at it. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. Because they were also like considered unclean if they were to touch somebody who was hurt, bleeding, injured, right? So they were following their religion's rules by actually ignoring the beaten up person.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting to think about it that way. But
Yeah, it's really loaded that way.
yeah. So the liberation radical way of engaging with the text allows us to get to those meaning, and get to that context of the story. That way it's not just a story that's like, oh, be good.
Right, which is ultimately more interesting anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm learning more about my family as I
Good. All right. So, Melissa, that Chrissy had to hop off, but we're going to talk about the jeepney hermeneutics part right now, because what is missing in this whole thing? Okay, I'm going to erase this. What's missing in this communication flow is feedback.
Love that.
So after a sender sends a message and then the receiver receives it, the receiver can send feedback back to the sender, right? But how do you do that if the text writers are all gone? How do you do that if all the text writers have passed away and they're from thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago, you know? So I would hope that part of the feedback, the missing piece, the feedback, is that we respond and give feedback through spiritual practice where we can commune with the divine, right? And be like, bruh, or whatever, however you identify God, sister, whatever, mother. How, just like interacting with divine through prayer, through spiritual practice and things like that. That's one way to give feedback to our ancient spiritual ancestors. Another way is through theological, writing papers and thinking about God in different kinds of ways. And another way is about being in community. Because community is how we can experience God in concrete ways, through other people, through creation, through nature. Those are ways that God concretely can connect with us and that we can connect with God. So I feel like those are the ways that we can provide feedback. And I'm going to, as one form of feedback from the receiver to the senders, who are either our spiritual ancestors or the divine or the worshiping community, is through different theological means, and one theological mean is through jeepney hermeneutics. All right, so I'm gonna get into that in a little bit. I'm gonna erase this part. No, I'll leave that up. Still here. Okay, so jeepney hermeneutics is something that I had learned about for the first time when I was in the Philippines on my first trip with the Philippine Solidarity Task Force of California, Nevada of the United Methodist Church. So in 2008, I'd been to the Philippines twice before, but then going to the Philippines in 2008 was an entirely different experience. And one of those experiences, like during that time in 2008, I got to visit the Union Theological Seminary, and I got to meet some cool theologians who were doing like liberation theology in the context of the Philippines. And I picked up this book at the University of Union Theological Seminary, and it was edited by Professor Revelation Volunta. He also signed my book, and so he also explained to us his this idea of jeepney hermeneutics. So a hermeneutic is a framework or a way of interpreting something, a way of interpreting a problem, a way of engaging in something. That's what a hermeneutic is, right? So how do we use the jeepney as a hermeneutic? That's odd, right? So Professor Reeve, and I'm going to shorten this, so I hope that if he sees this, this is not like a butchering of the idea. of the hermeneutic, but hang on. This is based on the text that talks about building or beating swords into plowshares. You'll find that text in, hold up, I got it somewhere. It's in Micah or in Amos. Hang on a second. Let me find it on my phone really quick.
Sorry, I got cut off.
Oh. All right, let me find the text really quick. Beating swords into plowshares. She's so talkative today. Oh, that's cute. Oh, that's cute. Okay. It is, oh, I was wrong. It's from Isaiah. Hold up, I get it. Okay. Swords into plowshares, the book of Isaiah. So Isaiah chapter 2, verse 3-4. And many people shall go and say, come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. And he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord of Jerusalem. He shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. So it's actually an anti-war text, right? Like after war, after travesty has passed and justice is sought, then we will be in a space where we can beat our swords into plowshares. So taking our weapons and beating them forming them into things that can, instead of be weapons of war, be weapons of cultivation, not weapons, tools of cultivations, tools of farming, tools of nourishment and enrichment, right? So that's the text in Isaiah. And so Professor Reeve takes that idea and applies it to the jeepney. Those of you who don't know what the jeepney is a vehicle unique to the Philippines, where it's like a bus. It's a form of public transportation. It's all decked out, painted, customized. It has words on it, and it's got decorations and all kinds of stuff inside. And let's see, I've seen them with Mickey Mouse on the outside, Transformers on the outside, tigers on the personalized. They're totally personalized. Sometimes it has a family's name, right? So you have the jeepney, right? But the way that the jeepney came into being was that it didn't just appear out of nowhere. It's not like all of a sudden, boom, there was a jeepney in the Philippines. The jeepney is actually a war vehicle from the US. So US, right? So it was a US war vehicle. It was used to transport soldiers, but not only soldiers. In the back of the jeepneys, they were shorter than the jeepneys. In the back of the jeeps, they would put the artillery there. They put the guns there, bullets, all that kind of stuff, and they would transport it. And then after World War II, the US just left the vehicles there, basically, in the Philippines. And so the Philippines, now having these war vehicles there from the US because of the military war past, they took these vehicles of war and they transformed them into jeepneys, which are then used to commute, which are then used to build community instead. So you take something that was brought to the Philippines as a weapon of war. The people themselves reinterpret them into community vehicles that were meant to bring community together.
Oh, wow. Oh.
And that is akin to beating your swords into plowshares, right? So this concept, how can we view the Bible in that way? Like, how can we view the Bible as a vehicle that came into the Philippines as a way of war, as a way of oppression? How can we turn them into jeepneys? How can we turn them into things that bring community together? You know, because the truth is that we can't act like the U.S. was never in the Philippines. We can't erase that. We can't go back to a past where the U.S. was never there, not in modern times, you know? What I appreciate about Jeepney hermeneutics is that it recognizes, yes, that there is a past, a rough past, an oppressive past, but we can transform that into something new. We could transform those oppressive things into things that will then liberate our people, you know? So I see this as, you know, feedback from the receiver. Like, you've given us this message, you've given us this message, and we're going to turn it into something that can be meaningful to our context and to our situation, you know. So that is Jeepney hermeneutics. I also wanted to do another plug for Professor Reeve. He wrote this book, Reading the Parables Inside a Jeepney, Reading the Parables of Jesus Inside a Jeepney. You can find this on Amazon. You can get a physical copy or on Kindle. And also, a second version is coming out too. What I appreciate about this book is that Professor Reeve looks at the parables through the lens of a jeepney. From the lens of parables that might sound like oppressive and perpetuating colonial ideas, colonial values, he takes them and brings them back into their context, that these are stories by the poor and for the poor so that they can understand their context better. It's not necessarily about submitting to God, but remembering the socioeconomic realities of the people who were following Jesus at the time and the people who were also being ministered to by Jesus at the time. So please check it out. We might go into this.
Okay, that's Professor Reeves. What's his name?
Yeah, Revelation, like the book of Revelation.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, Velunta, Velunta. All right. Okay, we have about 30 minutes left. Does anyone have anything you want to say? Any comments or things that are like, what? You want to get more I don't know, explanation or conversation about it? Anything. Okay, good night.
Thanks, Janelle. That was great. That was really interesting to hear.
Oh, thank you. Who was that?
Oh, it was Alicia and Oneda.
Oh, hey.
We like that. Hearing about the liberation theology too.
Oh, cool.
Is it true that they, radical liberation theology is more looking at current day situations and relating it to the Bible as well than liberal interpretations, or do they both do that about equally?
I think the difference is that I erased it. I think the difference is that the liberation and radical is that it's more, the basis is more on community versus how it impacts the individual first and foremost. I think for the liberal interpretation, it goes back to the individual and how the individual can change versus like how can the community and the individual as part of that community change and transform the world, which is really, it's a different, kind of a different paradigm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a good explanation. Thank you.
All right. If there are no more comments and thoughts at this time, if folks want to hear over chat or voice now, if y'all are down for another study, please let me know, or you can email me too.
Oh, there's a dog there.
Yeah, there's a
Oh, okay.
lot of living creatures in this space.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if there are Okay, now they're fighting. All right, if there are no more comments or anything right now, then oh, yay! Thanks, Jack. We will do more studies. I appreciate any feedback that you have over email and things like that. I know I just threw a lot of information at you, but I hope that you can take time to kind of sit with it and integrate and stuff like that. And yeah, all right. Thank you so much and for being willing participants in this study.
Thank you. Lots of food for thought. Always good. Yeah. Thanks,
Okay.
Janelle.
All right. Thanks. All right. Bye.
Good night.
Good night.